Okay, I'll tell you a funny story. So when I was younger, we used to have alfalfa in corn silage, and it seems like when I started going to college, we kind of got away from growing any alfalfa, and I'm pretty sure it's because all the hay bale throwing help went away. So we don't currently grow alfalfa on our farm, but it's a really, really great option for us and our livestock.
And she's going to tell us why. Sorry.
And I know. So my computer, go up here to the slideshow.
Okay.
Set up slideshow. I don't know why it's doing this. My computer. Speaker.
Oh, interesting.
Okay. When something doesn't work, sometimes you realize, I don't know, it's something.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you guys all for letting me come speak to you today about alfalfa. Thank you for inviting me, Paige, to do this. So we've heard a lot today about all these different forage species that we have here in the southeastern U.S. We have our tropical or our warm season annual species, warm season perennial species, cool season annuals, cool season perennials, and our legumes. And typically when we start thinking about these species, we can really categorize them not only by what time of year they grow, whether they're perennial or whether they're annual, but really we can categorize them by the amount of digestible energy that they provide to our livestock. And so what we typically think of, and this is an average situation, and it's definitely going to depend based on your management, that typically our warm season annual or warm season perennial grasses are a little bit lower in digestible energy compared to our warm season annual grasses, which is lower than our cool season perennial grasses, which is lower than our cool season annual grasses. And then finally, some of our most highly digestible forages is a lot of these legumes that we can incorporate into our pasture systems. And so if you think about how these forages can relate to our animal production, typically we think about our lower quality species that have a little bit lower digestibility, maybe a little more mature, really fit into our maintenance of our cattle or of our sheep. Typically when we start increasing that digestibility, we're able to meet or exceed the nutrient requirements for some of our animals that may be in moderate production. And finally, we want to use those high digestible, high nutrient rich forages for our animals that are really in that peak lactation. But when we start thinking about how alfalfa really fits into this system, well, I like to think of alfalfa being at the very, very top. So we typically think of alfalfa as being the queen of forages, especially here in the southeast and really across the United States. So alfalfa is a very high yielding perennial legume. It has very excellent nutritive quality, and it's really extremely versatile. We can use it in a lot of different situations. We can use it for haymaking, we can ensile it, we can green chop it, we can go out there and graze it. There's grazing tolerant varieties. We can use it in crop rotations, especially in a corn silage alfalfa rotation where we're trying to get some of that nitrogen and organic matter back into the ground. We can interseed it, and that's actually one of the big things that's going on here in the southeastern United States right now, especially in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, is where that we can grow Bermuda grass, come in the fall and interseed this alfalfa into that Bermuda grass, and that way we get that extra forage production in the springtime when that Bermuda grass hasn't quite greened up yet. Additionally, we're increasing the quality of that Bermuda grass by having that excellent nutritive value of that alfalfa into that Bermuda grass, but also that Bermuda grass or that alfalfa in that Bermuda grass is really helping feed that Bermuda grass from a nitrogen standpoint. And a lot of producers that do grow alfalfa do grow as a cash crop. There's a lot of horse producers in the area that are looking for alfalfa to feed to their equine species. So if we think about how alfalfa got here to the U.S., because it hasn't always been here. Alfalfa actually originated around the Black Sea in Turkey or Iran, in that area, and it's really been there for a long time. And alfalfa came from originated in an environment that it had a lot of drought, but their soils were really high in pH. So they had very, very high pH soils, and you can see that this is a very drought climate, but here's a picture, and I think this picture is from Turkey, but you can see the alfalfa growing there, and that's going to be really important that we come back to that in just a few minutes. But alfalfa's been around for extremely long periods of time. So it's thought of that alfalfa was in existence and being grazed by animals as early as 10,000 BC around that Black Sea. However, it didn't come to the United States until around the 1700s. And we think that alfalfa actually came to the U.S. Pretty much in 9 different germplasms. And you can see all the ways that we think that it was probably brought into the United States. So it has been around for a really long time and has been used in the U.S. for a couple hundreds of years as well. So today I want to talk to you about really 6 keys to establishing alfalfa and how we can really get a good success in our alfalfa stands right out the gate. And so one of those keys is that we really want to be able to identify a field that we can put it in, that we know that field is going to give that alfalfa a great start. So site selection is important. Additionally, soil testing is also important. And if you take anything away from today, take that soil testing and pH of your soils is probably the most important and biggest factor when it comes to having a successful establishment of alfalfa. Additionally, variety selection is also important that we're going to talk about later. Planting and how to get it out there in the fields and what kind of preparation you need in those fields. Weed and pest control we're going to talk about. And finally, we're going to wrap things up with talking about some harvest management with alfalfa. So starting with site selection, so first, to ensure our success in growing alfalfa, we really want to make sure that we get out there and we select a field that alfalfa is going to do really well in. And so when we think about site selection, we want to select a field that has well-drained soils, a field that has a high pH, preferably 6 or above, and alfalfa really likes pH soils that are in that 6.5 to 7 range. They do best in that range. Alfalfa does well in sandy loam and clay loam soils, and if you all have been out here trying to feed your animals here in the last couple of weeks with all the rain, you know that we have, that red mud is not limiting for us for sure. And of course, we do have to go out there and plant that alfalfa and potentially harvest it if you're thinking about using it as cash crop. So we want to make sure that we're selecting a field that we can get our machinery across as well. If we think about fields that are not suitable for alfalfa, we don't want any field that has waterlogged soils or soils that have a high water table. Additionally, we want to make sure that these fields that we're selecting doesn't have a shallow hard pan or bedrock that's pretty close to that soil surface. Additionally, I've already mentioned, but acidic soils will not do well with alfalfa. And I took this picture the other day at the Mountain Research Station. This is a couple of days after we'd had a rain. And so this is one of our bottom fields at the Mountain Research Station. You can see that there's quite a bit of standing water in this field. And in this field particularly, you can see we've got some puddles out here. This field always holds water, and so I would not recommend planting alfalfa in this field. And so this picture represents a field where we have a low spot and the water tends to pond here, and you can see that the alfalfa is really not doing very well in that field where we have a lot of standing water when we get these big rains like we've been having. Additionally, I mentioned that we want to make sure that our soils don't have that hard pan that's close to the surface, or we don't have a lot of rock that's not very deep down. And the reason for that is because alfalfa is a really deep-rooted plant, and so if we have those hard soil or hard pans, or we have some bedrock there, we're not going to allow those roots to reach their maximum potential, to get down there and get that water, because they are very drought-tolerant plants. And so if we choose a field that has those hard pans, we're really going to limit the root growth of alfalfa. And you can see how big relatively alfalfa's roots are compared to some of our other species, such as pea or corn or wheat. So we want to make sure we select a good field when it comes to that. Additionally, if you've had something that you've had in this field and you went out there and you had a bunch of weed problems and you went out there and sprayed it with something such as chaparral or Grazon Next, sometimes we can get some residual herbicide activity with that. So if you have sprayed those fields, you want to make sure that you're selecting a field that hasn't had that type of herbicide, typically 10 to 12 months prior to establishing that alfalfa. If you have sprayed that, Grazon Next out there and you think you're going to go plant it, alfalfa 2 or 3 months later, you're probably going to have some residual activity and you're probably going to have a very, very poor stand of alfalfa because of that. Additionally, there are some other herbicides that I'll throw up here that we want to make sure that we give a proper time for those herbicides to really dissipate in those fields. something such as Pastora, 4 to 12 months, and you can take a soil sample and send that off to really see what those activities are. You can do a bioassay on those. And this picture here just kind of shows some herbicide damage on some alfalfa, and so we do know that alfalfa does not tolerate any type of residual activity in those soils. So moving on to soil testing, again, I stress soil testing is probably one of the biggest things that we see with establishment failures. So soil testing is the priority here. And I will say with alfalfa, alfalfa is a very management intensive crop. Okay, so it's not going to be like some of our fescues where we've had this fescue stand growing out there for years and years and years, and we haven't touched it and it still looks like it's doing great. I cannot say the same about alfalfa. It's going to require a lot more of our attention than something such as tall fescue. Again, let me stress this again. Soil pH is critical to a good stand of alfalfa, a good establishment of alfalfa. And the reason for that is because soil pH really affects the availability of a lot of our soil nutrients. Okay? It can either make them available or make them not available in our soils. And so I just want to throw this graph up from Understander up in Wisconsin, and he has done a ton of work with alfalfa in his career. And so this graph shows the pH of the soils from 4.5 to 7.5 and dry matter and yields per pound per acre of alfalfa. And you can see as we start moving from a acidic soil pH of 4.5 up to a soil pH of a 6.5 to a 7, that we really can increase our forage alfalfa yields just by changing that soil pH. Okay. And if we think about alfalfa, I told you it was a very management intensive crop. It really has a small window of soil pH that it will tolerate and do well in compared to a lot of our other legume species. So alfalfa, again, the optimum soil pH is between 6.5 to 7 compared to some of our red clover and white clover that can tolerate a little bit wider spread in that soil pH. And just some of our additional clovers or additional legumes that we find. So that alfalfa is very particular to soil pH. And if we think about, if we're thinking about, well, we've selected a site, but it's kind of acidic and we want to raise that pH up, we need to start thinking about liming and fertilizing those soils a year in advance, because it does take some time to get that soil pH to the place we need it to be for alfalfa. Additionally, the reason besides the nutrient availability, which I'll get to in a second, with soil pH, I want to stress what soil pH actually does to the root system. And so these are just 3 different pictures at different soil pHs. We have a soil pH of 6.5, and you can see that these roots are really, really deep. We have a lot of root hairs on them, so they're taking up a lot of nutrients. However, as we move to more acidic soils, we have much shorter, shallow roots. They don't have near as many root hairs on them, so they're not coming in contact with as much soil. But as we increase it from 5.2 to 5.5, you can see that we get, a substantial increase in root development, but just by changing that pH just slightly. Additionally, I mentioned that soil pH can have a huge effect on nutrient availability. And so this graph shows our different soil pHs from a soil pH of a 4 up to a soil pH of a 9 and 10. And these are different macronutrients and micronutrients that we find in the soil that our plants need. And so as we start increasing that soil pH, we're seeing that a lot of these nutrients are becoming more available. So this graph, the red means that these nutrients are not available. So for nitrogen, for instance, at a acidic soil pH of 4, that nitrogen is not available to those plants, but as we start moving into the green, it becomes more available. And this box represents really the optimum soil pH for alfalfa, is that 6.5 to 7 range. And you can see that in that range, really all of these nutrients are going to be available to that alfalfa. But if we'd moved the box this way, we'd have very few nutrients actually available to that alfalfa. So that's one of the reasons that this soil pH is so important to our alfalfa. Okay. But you may be thinking, well, moving that soil pH just a couple of points, is it going to make that big of a difference to my wallet? Okay, so I'm going to throw this table up here. So this table represents the difference in efficiency and cost when we take that soil pH from a 5.6 up to a 6.2. So we're only changing it by just over a half of a percentage point or half of a point. And so this is our nutrients, our nitrogen, phosphate, and potash, which are probably going to be, which are going to be taken up in large amounts by the alfalfa. Typically, this is what we think of as the amount that's going to be used annually from a crop, unit price, and the decrease in efficiency when we're going from a 6.2 pH soil to a 5.6% soil. So this could be from just the nitrogen not being available. This could be from the roots being smaller and not really being able to branch out and get those nutrients in. We see a 35% decrease in efficiency in nitrogen, a 50% decrease in phosphate, and a 10% decrease in potash. And when we start thinking about the value of those nutrients on a per pound or dollar per pound per acre basis, we see that we could actually be losing $62 an acre because of that soil pH. Is everybody following me at this point? Okay.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Go back to that. Is that reduction in the $42 decrease, is that kind of a textbook calculation, or is that reality if alfalfa is making its own nitrogen?
That's going to be a textbook calculation. Yeah, and this isn't really particular for just alfalfa. This is just kind of overall.
If it was corn, for example, then you could definitely say the $42.
Yeah. Yeah. So this wasn't one study just in particular for alfalfa. This is kind of textbook of what we're seeing overall averaged through several different species. Additionally, alfalfa, I said, requires a lot of management, much more management intensive than a lot of our other forage crops, and it is taking up a lot of nutrients out of that soil compared to a lot of our other crops. Okay, and so this graph just represents some of our nutrients that we find in the ground: nitrogen, phosphate, potash, calcium, and magnesium, and the amount of nutrients that are being removed in a pounds per nutrient per acre per year basis for alfalfa, Bermuda grass, orchard grass, perennial peanut, which is Florida, but that was in this case, this study, and tall fescue. And we see that alfalfa is removing a lot more nitrogen than any of our other forage species. Additionally, alfalfa is removing a lot of phosphate. It's definitely removing a lot of potash compared to a lot of our other forage species. And then calcium and magnesium are variable. But what I want you to take home from this graph is that alfalfa is removing a lot of nutrients from our soil. So we're going to have to go out there and fertilize that alfalfa fields to really make sure that we're reaching that maximum productivity of our alfalfa stands. Additionally, I also want to mention that in alfalfa, aluminum toxicity can be a problem in low soil pHs. So what's happening is that in low soil pH, that aluminum ion is out there and it's causing our roots to not develop properly. This is our control where we are not allowing, or we're allowing aluminum toxicity to occur. And you can see in those low soil pHs that our root system is just barely there. It's barely holding on. It's not allowing a lot of water or nutrient uptake in the alfalfa plant. However, if we raise that soil pH, or if we apply something like gypsum to that soil to really bind that aluminum, that we're getting a lot more root growth, root depth, root penetration into those soils. And so aluminum toxicity can be a problem. But again, as we start increasing that soil pH, that aluminum ions are bound and therefore allowing those roots to fully develop like they should. So another reason that we really want to make sure that soil pH is really in check in this alfalfa stand. Additionally, variety selection is also another key to a successful stand of alfalfa. When we think about profitability in alfalfa fields, there's a couple key areas that we want to look at with variety selection. Obviously, yield is important and it's one of our main factors when looking at profitability of a forage stand, especially in alfalfa. Additionally, quality is also something that's going to be very important, and that really has a lot more to do with a lot of our management practices in alfalfa. However, persistence is a factor that we want to look for. Winter hardiness and disease resistance are all factors that we want to look for that will help increase our profitability of the alfalfa stand. And there's quite a few alfalfa forage variety tests throughout the Southeast that you can look at to really see which forage species or which alfalfa variety species are working well in our area. But I do want to just touch on this winter hardiness. There are some fall dormancy scores in alfalfa that we should be aware of. And fall dormancy, I think it used to be on a 1 to 9 scale, but as we've started developing some of these varieties that are more or less fall dormant, I think we've now raised that to a 10 and 11, where 11 is very little fall dormancy and a score of a 1 is very fall dormant. And so in our area, we particularly want to be paying attention to the fall dormancy scores of 4, 5, and 6, and those will work well in our area. Fall dormancy is related to winter hardiness. So we want to make sure that our alfalfa stands can make it through the winter. And so as we move from a fall dormancy of a 3, 4, and 5, which are going to be slower to green up in spring, and they're going to not produce as long in the fall, down to a 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 in Florida, where they have a longer growing season, and that alfalfa can green up earlier and produce longer into the fall as well. And so this is just a picture I found of the fall dormancy rating. And how they decide that fall dormancy rating is that after we take a cutting in, I think it's around September 1, they look at regrowth about 28 days later after they've taken that fall cutting. And so the really fall dormant alfalfa stands are going to have very little regrowth, whereas the less fall dormant stands are going to have much more regrowth. And that's really depicted here as if this would be a fall dormancy of a 1, where there's not a whole lot of fall growth, and that plant is going to really put some nutrients into the crown and the root system to help it get through the winter, whereas the fall dormancy of 11 is still actively growing longer into that fall. Additionally, planting is also a very important topic when talking about alfalfa establishment, and alfalfa can be either conventionally tilled and drilled in that way, or we can do a no-till drill type establishment. But this study was taking place in Wisconsin, where they've done a lot of the alfalfa forage research, and Dr. Undersander at Wisconsin found that, comparing conventional tillage versus a no